Greetings all, Ferrari601 here. Welcome back to rFactor. I believe I've got the frame rate issues solved now. I do apologize for that. However, another absolutely classic memory that I think a lot of us have from the rFactor 1 days is this mod, CTDP Formula 1 2005. I mentioned this in the previous video that I put up driving the BMW Sauber, but this is the 2005 season, the last full year of the V10, and we are in the McLaren MP4 undoubtedly the fastest car of 2005. However, not the most reliable. It did not win the World Championship in either the drivers or constructors category. However, this was my first take of Formula 1 in the V10 era. And of course, this mod was put out in the days when the V10 era was not a distant memory. It had only been concluded really the year before in 2006. There was still a V10 powered car on the grid, although it was basically a castrated V10. Rev and air intake limited, of course, was the Cosworth TJ 2005 unit in the back of the Toro Rosso. However, we do not have any restrictions in this car, the McLaren MP4. Quite recently, VRC for Assetto Corsa have released an MP4, and they're still working on it, continuing to polish it little by little. It's still in 0.1 beta spec, but I think we can expect an update on it reasonably soon. However, this was the first time that the MP4 ever graced its presence in sim racing here in rFactor 1. Looking around the cockpit in this thing, it's very easy to tell that we are driving something that is quite dated by this point. Looking at the textures here on the cockpit surround there and that soft cushioned area, well, the resolution looks like it was, I don't know, shall we say the textures were captured with a potato. But remember, for its time, this was absolutely brilliant. We can see we've got detail down in the cockpit. We've got pretty good detail actually on the steering wheel, not too far off what we see nowadays in sims like Assetto Corsa or iRacing, but back in the day, this was the bee's knees. This was the ultimate speed machine in rFactor, and I have to say it is still pretty quick, even though we now have a much better version of it available now in Assetto Corsa. Anyway, let's get the ignition switched on. The car comes to life. You can see our dash display there. Speed is going to be in the left-hand window. Obviously, we've got a gear position indicator in the center. We've got a position indicator, in other words, race position, and then off to the extreme right, we have how many laps we have pulled. Across the top, shift lights, and that's about it for our instrumentation in this thing. Many, many videos went up on my channel years ago, back when rFactor was still the gold standard with this car. This is going to be one more. Let's get the engine fired up. You know, everything as you see it and as you hear it in this car is as it was back in the day. I've done no modifications to it whatsoever. This is what you got, although it's probably not what a lot of you used to see, and it's not what I used to see because my system specs at the time were not good enough to run rFactor at max settings. Nowadays, this computer I've got now, it's barely breaking a sweat running rFactor at max graphics, but those were the days. You had to compromise. You got what you paid for. Still true today, but nowadays your dollar goes a lot further in terms of graphics. Anyway, before we overheat just ticking over here in the pit lane, speed limiter on, first gear selected, let's pull away in the McLaren MP4 as I first drove it all those years ago. Got the engine dialed back, just confirming our settings. We are good. Speed limiter off. Coming out onto this Istanbul circuit is the first time in a long time that I've driven it. Drove it briefly in rFactor 2 last week, but not in this. There's almost full revs on that V10. We are in the lowest engine mode. We've got 10 steps on the rev limiter. We can rev it out all the way to 19,300 RPM. We're upshifting at about 18.6 right now. Legendary turn 8 here at Istanbul. It is such a shame that Formula 1 no longer goes here. Of course, 2005 was the first year of the Turkish Grand Prix. It was won by Kimi Räikkönen in this car, of course. It's one of my earlier Formula 1 fandom memories. Oh yeah, we're pretty quick. 305 kilometers an hour, that's very sideways, and we spin it. A little bit of rear locking there. We're going to have to dial the brake bias out a little bit. Nearly saved it. Need a little bit more front end on the brakes there. We'll get that dialed out for the next lap for sure. Oh, the acceleration on this thing is violent, absolutely violent. Down into turn 1, lots of bumps. Tire pressures are still a little bit low. They're not fully up to temperature. Remember, 2005, one set of tires for both qualifying attempts and the race. So they had to be pretty resilient. Ah, yes. It's a lot better nowadays with the much higher frame rates that we're able to get now. I remember back in 2010, if you go back and look at some of my very old videos, you'll see that the frame rates that I was achieving at 480p were absolutely detestable. I was only managing about 25, 30 frames per second on a good day. Now, even with the screen capture running, I'm getting 178 frames per second. You can't see the readout that I can see, but that's what I'm reading. Between 160 and 180, there or thereabout. Let's turn the boost up a little bit. There we go. Full revs now available to us from the Mercedes Ilmor in the back of this car. What have we got? Full power. That's 310 kilometers an hour in 6th gear. And we lose it again. Bumps. This car doesn't like bumps. Okay. It's a learning curve all over again. It has been probably 5 years since I've driven this car. In this sim, in this spec, on this circuit. Definitely some memory refreshing going on here. Understeer. Again, the car is not very happy over these bumps. Perhaps it's a little bit too stiffly sprung, we'll see. Not taking turn 8 flat out by any means. Just remember in 2005, Kimi and Montoya would pop 7th gear right about here at the top of the hill down the back straight. Always thought that just sounded really cool. Let's not lose it here. When we have not, that's good. Hesitating a little bit on the throttle just to get over the bigger bumps. Bit of a lockup there with the weight transfer, that's okay. Traction control working overtime. Man, I do have to say, just the finer adjustments that I'm able to make in here as we go off the circuit big time. With the increased frame rate nowadays, it is so much easier to drive this thing. I remember struggling with this on the computer that I was running in 2010. Just impossible to control this thing with any high degree of precision. I'm amazed that I was able to do the lap times that I could do back then, because I was driving this thing literally on 30 frames per second, and it was very much undrivable. 30 frames per second is fine for broadcast television, but not for sim racing.
Alright, that was a 1:29.85.
Still about 4 seconds off of a really quick time. That's okay. Not trying to break any records here today, just trying to get my eye back in with this thing. Again, the Assetto Corsa version, let's talk about that a little bit. VRC did a brilliant job on that car. First of all, their car looks fantastic. It looks almost exactly like the real thing. It handles fantastically. It's been out for quite a few months now. A lot of people, including myself, have wondered whether or not it's perhaps a little bit too quick, because it is far and away the quickest realistic car on Assetto Corsa. And in terms of quickest cars ever on Assetto Corsa, I think you've got the Red Bull X2010, and then you have the very experimental Formula DS over on Race Department. But the MP420, in terms of real-world cars in Assetto Corsa, it's the quickest thing out there. Sometimes the F2004 can give it a run for its money on some circuits, but far and away, on aggregate, the quickest car in Assetto Corsa. This, in this current spec, with the setup I've got on it, definitely is slower than VRC's version. With a little bit of setup work, could I perhaps approach some of the lap times? Maybe. It's also comparing apples to oranges, though, because rFactor is a very different sim than Assetto Corsa. In some respects, even though rFactor is as old as it is, I think it still does some things better.
1:29.51.
For example, the way the car reacts over bumps and things, I think rFactor does a better job than Assetto Corsa does. The tire model, Assetto Corsa, it's better. However, for the day, of course, this was what you wanted. It was basically the only thing you could get if you wanted a really versatile, realistic sim racing experience. Engine power feels quite similar to the VRC version, as do the brakes. It's much easier to lock the brakes here in rFactor, though, than it is in Assetto Corsa. Always was, and I think it always will be. One thing that VRC definitely did a lot better than CTDP, the sounds. This thing, as have all of the other cars in the CTDP 2005 mod, just has these generic V10 sounds. You'll find that on any CTDP car from this 2005 mod pack. They themselves are derived from native rFactor sounds, I believe, if not some sounds recycled from F1 Challenge, which is even older than rFactor, but they were appropriate for the era. VRC, though, no comparison, night and day difference in terms of the sounds. Not to mention the textures and the model. This thing, you could probably count on all 10 fingers the amount of different polygons in this model. The VRC model, it is so good, you zoom in, you can't see any pixelation.
That was a 1:30.06.
Of course, you've got to remember the graphics programs, undoubtedly, that the CTDP modelers were using back then probably could only display, at best, in 16:9. Would have been good for maybe 1024 by 768 in terms of output, so that's what they were playing with. That's where rFactor's happy running. I'm running it in 16:9, having some aberrations in textures, but it seems to be stable enough. But just the way this thing takes off, it is something. It was back then, and it still is today. And now that we've done a few laps, the tires feel like they've come together really nicely. Not locking up as much as I was in the early laps. I don't know how much fuel we've got on board, though.
Alright, that was a 1:30.48.
Of course, I could open up the HUD and see, but I don't want to. I'll get a warning in the UI, I think, once we start to run out. But so far, we'll continue this. 4 apices there in turn 8. It's tremendous. I remember seeing this track layout for the first time in 2005 and watching the Speed Channel coverage. Remember those guys? Watching the Speed Channel coverage of qualifying and seeing the onboard laps. Just amazing to watch these guys going through turn 8 here at Istanbul. A bit of rear locking. The car is still not quite happy under braking. Not quite sure what to do about that, if I'm honest. And what's our lap time?
Alright, that was a 1:29.26.
29.26. Really not great at all. Who am I kidding? Doesn't matter. Just enjoying this one. Understeer here at the bottom of the hill into the long right-hander. Again, setup work. I've done no setup work on this car in about 5 years, and it definitely shows. But that is all right. Pull into the pits. Limiter line is farther back than it should be. Nonetheless, in the box, shut the engine down. And there it is, the MP420 from CTDP. And as my force feedback goes all over the place, it was a really nicely put together mod, and this was a particularly nicely put together car in that mod. As we were talking about on the BMW F106, you can see the rear rain light here. It's behaving much more like a light. It is still a texture mask, I believe, but we don't see it from head on, which of course is ideal. And then of course just looking in more closely, you can take a look at what CTDP were able to do with their modeling. Obviously the textures and the fidelity of the model as well, certainly nowhere near what we're seeing from VRC today, but given the era that we're talking about and given the technical limitations of the time, quite nicely put together, I must say, from CTDP. Again, I wish I could have given these guys their proper credit back when this was new, but I just didn't have the capabilities back then, so I'm trying to do it now. However, though, I've got to say, once again, just as I said in the previous video, this is definitely a testament to how far we have come in terms of sim racing technology, and although it is most decidedly obsolete nowadays, it is still a whole lot of fun to come into rFactor and to play with the old mods that used to get me all excited back when I was about 15, 16 years old. Very, very cool. Anyway, though, I will leave you with a couple of hot laps from external as well as onboard cameras so we can reminisce about the CTDP McLaren MP420 here at one of my favorite circuits ever, Istanbul. For Ironman601 saying thank you all very, very much for watching, and of course, we will see you soon. Stay tuned for the hot laps.